Right, Ryan, I'm going to hold you there because I've just fixed a technical error on my end. Whereas we were chatting away to this, and no one's been able to watch because it was set to private. So I was wondering why the view count wasn't going up. So we've been chattering away to ourselves. So I'm just going to say hi to everyone, and we're going to roll with it like this, and then I'll chop it up and re-upload it later. All right.
Okay.
So hi everyone. You join me and Ryan Cummins here live. We've been nattering away for the past few minutes about religious education, which is what today's video is about. Just before we crack on with that, remember, you can get yourself a horse. His name is Keith, and he could be in your house by Christmas if you follow the rules of the competition, which are to subscribe to the Brit Vengers and let me know where you've seen Daniel behind me around and about. Make sure you get involved in the comments tonight because we're going to have a Q&A with Ryan, who is a religious education teacher. I'll let him introduce himself in a moment. And yeah, this is the first in a series of videos where we're going to be talking all about external perspectives on Mormonism. So, Ryan, introduce yourself to the people who are now watching because we sorted it.
Excellent. Okay, so yeah, I'm Ryan Cummins. A little bit of a background to me would be that I am a religious education teacher. I've been teaching religious education, or philosophy and religion is the branding that we go with at my school, for 2 years now. Before that, I was in Cambridge, studied at the University of Cambridge for a bachelor's degree in theology and religious studies. So I spent 3 years doing that. And then after that, I did a 1-year qualification called a postgraduate certificate of education, which is the main university-based route into teaching in the UK, with a specialism in religious studies, and then got my current job and been living the dream ever since.
Absolutely. That's brilliant. And I just want to say to you all that religious education in the UK does not form part of the curriculum. Mormonism certainly doesn't not form part of the curriculum in the same way it does in Utah. So seminary isn't part of our schooling system, so we get up and do it separately at the chapel, as in many other parts of the world. That's how we'll kind of interact with seminary, as opposed to it being part of the schooling system there. But I wanted to talk real quick. Oh, go on.
Yeah, I was going to say, perhaps as well, it might be helpful just for people who are not familiar with what religious education is or involves in the UK. Mm-hmm. So it's not seminary or anything like that. It's typically non-confessional, so there's no it's not an attempt to teach one particular religion as being true. It's not an attempt to initiate children into a particular faith or worldview. It has kind of had elements of that in the past, but I'd say for the last 50, 60, 70 years, it's been treated more as the neutral and objective, although both of those terms can be questioned, study of religion and worldviews. So it's a way of learning about religion, learning about religious concepts, evaluating them. Children are given the space to consider which ones they find most persuasive or not, but there's no kind of attempt to present one of these things as the truth, which must be accepted.
Okay.
In most schools, faith schools are different.
Slightly different. Okay, but in your mainstream, sort of more secular school, that's what you get. Okay. Well, so my experience of religious education was quite an interesting one. We talked a bit about this before the show, and in our little take there where no one was watching. So I'll talk about it again. I wasn't allowed to take religious education classes because in our school planner, in some of the school descriptions of Christianity, they said all Christians believe in the Holy Trinity, or in the concept of the Trinity. And I took exception to that. I said, no, they don't. Mormons don't. And I tried to inform my religious education teacher. I ended up becoming fairly kind of militantly Mormon towards the classes, because I just, every time Christianity was generalized and it didn't include sort of the concepts of Mormonism or our unique theology, I was not very tolerant to that. That was the mindset I kind of I had. And so I wanted to ask Ryan, as a professional teacher, whether he would kick me out of his class or whether he would have allowed me to stay in his class. What do you say?
So I think I would have made every effort to include you in the class, especially because it's a statutory requirement of schools to offer religious education to all pupils. It's not actually compulsory for students to study it. So there is a legally enshrined right for parents to withdraw their children from religious education, which they don't have for any other subject apart from sex education.
Right.
But yeah, I think, you know,
So
children.
my parents may have withdrawn me. I think that may be what actually happened.
Yeah, yeah, um, sure. So
Under
yeah,
duress.
I think it's good to kind of allow students that opportunity to challenge and to engage actually with the subject that they're studying. Um, I think it's actually particularly the nature of the question or the criticism that you raised about these kind of sweeping generalizations about what, you know, Christians believe, or what Christians do, are very widespread in religious education, but also quite inaccurate. And it's a particular issue that was highlighted when I was training to become a teacher during my PGCE. And I heard from, I was very privileged and fortunate to hear from quite a few people who are well trained in religious education pedagogy. And quite a common thing that I heard from them was this fact that the teaching of Christianity does not take into sufficient account the internal diversity of Christianity. So that includes theological diversity, as in, you know, not all Christians believe in the Trinity, not all Christians believe in original sin, for example. But it also includes, you know, we don't do a good enough job, I don't feel, of exploring ethnic diversity, practical diversity within Christianity, different forms of Christian worship. I do think that it's moving in a better direction, and that it's getting better. But actually, when I first started at my current school, one of the first ways that I kind of introduced Mormonism into the curriculum, which is separate from the more systematic thing that I've attempted more recently, which we'll talk about later. But actually, at the start of the GCSE course, when we start with Christian beliefs, before getting stuck into the content, just doing a lesson on Christian diversity, and looking, okay, well, what exactly the differences between Catholics and Protestants. And as part of that, I included an activity looking at Mormonism and kind of saying, you know, so we've just looked at all of the generalizations about what Christians believe. Now, here's a video about a Christian denomination that most of these, or a lot of these, don't really properly apply to. So I think it's important to actually engage with the fact that religion is not neat, and can't be kind of reduced to this single, you know, unchanging essence. Any particular religious tradition is diverse. The way that it manifests itself in people's lives is diverse. Because even, you know, within Mormonism, trying to pin down exactly what Mormonism teaches on a particular issue is challenging. So I think it's really important that you challenge that when you were in your RE classroom.
Okay, well, I'm glad you think I did the right thing. I probably didn't go about it the right way, but you know, I was young, and that's how it goes. So I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit then about how you started to bring Mormonism into the classroom. How did it end up in the classroom? How did you end up in that position? I'm going to make you full screen while I deal with some other technical things.
Okay. So when I started at my current job, which is my first full proper teaching role, our head of department at our school had inherited from the previous head of department this unit titled Cults, and it was a year 9 unit, so it's for students aged 13 to 14, of about a term, so in total probably about 12 lessons, which explored this idea of cults in quite a sensationalist way. It looked specifically at very small and very extreme examples of cults, and often through these documentaries, which were very engaging and quite enjoyable and entertaining, but not necessarily the most academically rigorous. And students really enjoyed that unit. It was very popular. It went down very well with them. But I felt, and my head of department felt a similar thing, that it encouraged just a kind of an opportunity to laugh and point at these these people who seem to believe and do outrageous and bizarre things. And there didn't seem to be a really clear rationale or educational benefit to what was going on. And I suggested to my head of department that including a few lessons on the Latter-day Saint movement could be quite an interesting way to balance out some of these more extreme and sensationalist elements within the unit, for multiple reasons. Because I think the Latter-day Saint movement does a really good job of blurring the boundaries between a mainstream religious tradition and an extreme cult. It has elements which can perhaps be identified as being in common or having similarities with some of these groups and some of these groups that we might label as cults. But in the same breath, it's also much larger, much more successful, and I think probably much more widely respected than some of these groups. So he kind of gave me the go-ahead, gave me the green light, and asked me if I would kind of have a go at revamping this unit and turning it into something a little bit more robust. So I had a go at that over the summer, and what we came up with the support of other people in my department as well, was a unit which we called Cults and New Religious Movements. So trying to get away from just the overly pejorative language of just labeling them all as cults. And we started the unit with just an introductory lesson about what is religion, first of all. And then moving on from that, our second lesson kind of tackled head on this concept of a cult. What is a cult? Which kinds of groups get this label thrown at them? Is it an accurate label? Is it a helpful label? What does it even mean to be a cult? Is there a clearly definable list of characteristics? And so as part of that lesson, we look at a couple of different ideas and perspectives on cults. So ranging from we look at some quite sensationalist anti-cult material from a few decades ago, talking about brainwashing and indoctrination and mass suicide and things like that. And then to kind of counterbalance that perspective, we look at a video and interview with a very highly respected sociologist of religion at the London School of Economics called Professor Eileen Barker. Professor Eileen Barker is kind of well known within the field of new religious movements and sociology of religion, mainly for her attempt to counter-argue against some of the more extreme claims that were being made about cults. So, for example, she kind of questioned this whole narrative around brainwashing and whether is that a real thing, and also just the whole concept of a cult in general. She kind of makes the argument that the term has come to mean simply a religion that you don't like. But she also offers some useful criteria and characteristics which a lot of these groups share, which, if you get away from some of the more pejorative language, can be used as the basis for a meaningful academic category. So things like having a charismatic leader, things like being composed primarily of first-generation membership, having beliefs or practices which are widely regarded as atypical of wider society, things of that nature. So that kind of sets up the groundwork, and then following that, we did 3 in-depth lessons focusing explicitly and specifically on the Latter-day Saint movement as kind of a case study of a new religion. So the third lesson in the whole unit, which is the first lesson in our little series of lessons on the Latter-day Saint movement, focused on Joseph Smith and the First Vision. In nowhere near enough detail, but that's what we were kind of exploring in our first lesson. So briefly, students introduced to what the Latter-day Saint movement is, and I deliberately did that using some sources from a variety of perspectives. So I included a couple of LDS Church sources, so videos about, for example, like some clips from Joseph Smith, Prophet of the Restoration,
Right. Yeah.
and you know, just clips from a couple of LDS sources, and then also kind of counterbalancing that with a quite a well researched YouTube video, pretty well researched in my opinion, YouTube video from someone who is not a Mormon and has never been involved in Mormonism, which just kind of gave a brief overview of the church history, church origins, and things like that. And so, with that kind of brief introduction to what Mormonism is, then in the second half of the lesson, dive into Joseph Smith and the First Vision. And I put together a reading resource which brings together or kind of combines extracts from Joseph Smith's different accounts of the First Vision. The inspiration for this, I have to credit Dr. James Holt at the University of Chester, who is undoubtedly I was going to say the leading, but probably the only academic scholar in the UK who talks about Mormonism and religious education. So he, I believe, is a member of the church, and he has written quite extensively about including Mormonism in religious education. And on his website, he has an idea for an activity based around the First Vision, which essentially just involved reading the canonized 1838 account of Joseph Smith history all the way through from beginning to end, and then students to write a newspaper article about it at the end, kind of imagining that they are the Palmyra Times or something from that time period. And I like the idea of the newspaper article. It's a well established technique in RE, because it ticks a number of boxes. You get the students to show that they know what happens in the story, but it also encourages some evaluation, because you can get them to say, well, you need to imagine that you've interviewed someone who is critical of this story. Imagine you've interviewed the believer. So I like that story, but I felt that just focusing on the one single account, when as I'm sure
we know
there are multiple different accounts, seemed like a missed opportunity, because I think what's so fascinating, the kind of the rationale for exploring the First Vision, is not just that it's part of Mormonism, but that it allows you to explore things like the nature of religious experience, and whether, how reliable are these religious experiences as the grounds for belief. So I kind of constructed a slightly different resource, which gives a summarized version of the story using kind of extracts from his different accounts at different points. By the way, one big advantage to doing that is that in all of his other accounts, Joseph gets to the point a hell of a lot quicker than so rather than spending half an hour reading through the entire thing, with you can just kind of here I went into the woods. So that I put that together, and then following that, students have the opportunity to answer. They have a choice of questions that they can answer about the First Vision, and I tried to include a variety of questions that would allow students to explore a diversity of philosophical issues that I think the First Vision raises. So, well, not just philosophical and historical and theological issues. So, for example, one of them would be how outline a couple of the differences between First Vision accounts, and do you think that these differences are significant or not? Another one might be, do you think that Joseph Smith went about working out which religion was true in the right way? Do you think his idea of how to figure it out was a good one or not? And various questions like that. So that was kind of I thought the logical place to start for an investigation of Mormonism was the First Vision of Joseph Smith. Okay. So yeah.
And then so that's your first. Is that your first lesson?
Yes.
So that's quite a lot in a first lesson for kids. You're like, so here is the fundamental Genesis story of Mormonism, and we're going to look at lots of different accounts of it, and we're going to look at different kind of sources regarding it. and then I want you to tell me about it. And so for some of these students, this is obviously the first time they've ever even heard this story. What sort of reactions do you get from students? Like, you know what students are like, they'll just say what's on their mind. So what sort of reactions do you get to the first vision from British school kids?
Really interesting. So something that surprised me actually, just right off the bat, was quite a few of them knew more than I was expecting them to know
Right.
about First Vision story, mainly from South Park.
Right.
So they came at it with certain preconceptions.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, the initial reactions, so many of them were just, how on earth does anybody believe this?
Right.
We're just, why on earth does anybody believe this? And it was quite interesting because the previous lesson, when we've been doing our lesson on new religious movements and cults, we've looked at that question. Said, you know, these groups have beliefs which seem strange. What are some possible reasons why people might, you know, why do people join them? Why do people continue to believe them? And yet, when they were actually confronted with this story, with this example, that their initial reaction is kind of disbelief a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, they're a diverse bunch. A few of them were quite sympathetic towards Joseph Smith. A few of them did a really good job actually of defending the believability of the story, and making analogies with stories that they knew of biblical figures, and saying, well, if you believe that this happened to these people in the Bible, it's not a stretch of the imagination to think it could happen to somebody else. So yeah, kind of a variety of responses.
Okay. So do you want us to run us real quick through the second and third lesson? What else do you teach them?
Yeah. So the second lesson is a kind of a whistle-stop introduction to the modern LDS Church. So again, these are a couple of variety of sources. Some from the LDS Church themselves, kind of videos that they put out, and then also a video from someone who's not a member. So looking firstly at kind of key beliefs, things to do with like the plan of salvation, articles of faith, things of that nature, and then another kind of information sheet, reading resource that I put together that focused in depth on two specific LDS practices, because there wouldn't be enough time to do all of them and to do justice to them. So I decided to go with missionary work and the temple.
Ooh, okay.
Both, my kind of rationale, my thinking was that both of those I feel in some way are not just incidental to Mormonism, but actually really quite fundamental to
quintessentially Mormon
identity.
Yeah.
So that was one reason, but also I think those are the two which most invite a comparison with kind of cultier organization. So I think it's a useful kind of springboard into that discussion if students have some understanding of missionary work in the temple. So in terms of the structure of the lesson, very similar to the first one on Joseph Smith, watch videos and read this.
So, okay, I have to ask this question. Everyone's going to want to know, do you show them any of the endowment ceremony?
No.
Okay.
No, I didn't.
Is there a reason for that?
Respect, mainly. I felt, and also something that I had to be mindful of when planning these lessons in a way that I didn't have to be when I was planning the one on Scientology, for example, is that there's every chance that at some point we could have a student who is a Latter-day Saint.
Yeah.
And so the whole time planning these, I'm trying to be mindful of thinking, how would I feel if I were a believing Latter-day Saint teenager sitting in this classroom, having my beliefs spoken about, and would I feel that the way that's being presented is disrespectful?
Yeah, that's totally fair.
So yeah, I didn't show the endowment ceremony. I was also vague about exactly what goes on in the temple.
Right.
My laptop is just. I just need to plug it in.
Yeah, go for it. So everyone, that is a great chance for a quick break to talk about what's gone on so far and the fact that we've had some technical difficulties and I can't see the YouTube comments up on here, so I'm having to look on my phone. But make sure to pop some questions you have for Ryan in the chat, because we are going to be doing a bit of a Q&A in a few minutes or so once we've done a bit more talking about how he presents Mormonism. But it's fascinating to me, seeing this kind of perspective on teaching Mormonism, because so often as members, our perspective on teaching Mormonism is trying to convert people. We start getting teary-eyed when we say in the spring of 1820, and we start to, all this sort of stuff starts to happen. And yeah, so teaching Mormonism from this sort of objective standpoint is really fascinating. Sorry, carry on, Ryan.
Yeah, sorry that my lighting has kind of
It's disappeared. That's fine.
disappeared. But yeah, so yeah, those are the first two lessons, and essentially that's kind of all that we could go into in terms of the amount of time that we have allocated to us. We only have an hour a week. So then the third lesson, the final lesson on Mormonism and the Latter-day Saint movement, is essentially giving the lead over to them. They have to write an essay, sort of a small mini essay. And they have a choice of titles. They can either do it on whether or not the first vision is a believable story, or the other statement they respond to is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is a dangerous cult. So both of those statements were kind of deliberately designed so that you could present arguments on both sides. I'm not saying that the arguments are equally balanced, but the arguments can be made on both sides. And secondly, they are somewhat provocative. Their statements, I know, will get a response from the students.
Yeah.
So that was, and that's essentially it. That's it. Short series of 3 lessons, and then the rest of the unit we look at a few other case studies of.
Yeah. I'm surprised you managed to shoehorn that much Mormonism in, if I'm honest. That's quite impressive. We've had a question in the chat already from Mark Johnson, who says, do you think there is mileage in covering wealth and religion with the LDS Church as an example?
Absolutely. And actually, that's an excellent question, because that is something that I've reflected on having taught it, because it did come up a lot when I taught it. So I teach 3 different classes. So I've taught this kind of series of lessons to 3 different groups. And with every single one of them, the issue of money and wealth came up, because we'd be watching these videos, and ironically, actually, it was often the ones the LDS Church themselves had produced that got this reaction from students, where they were saying, "How did they afford?" Or look at that temple, like that's really, really, really expensive, surely.
Yeah.
How do they afford all this? And when they were asking that question, I would kind of realize, oh yeah, I didn't put anything about tithing into these lessons at all. And so I would then explain it to them, kind of, just off the cuff, explain, oh yeah, by the way, if you want to be part of this church, you have to pay 10% of everything that you earn to them. And that got a really strong reaction from them. I think as well, partly because it's a private school, a lot of them come from pretty wealthy families.
Yeah.
And so, 10% of their income is a lot. So yeah, that was quite interesting. And then actually off the back of that, having conversations with other members of my department, just kind of informally mentioning to them, oh yeah, I didn't put in there that they have to pay 10% of their income. And my other people in my department were like, oh yeah, that's a pretty significant thing to mention, because it does really affect the way that you think about it in relation to whether it's dangerous, whether it's harmful. So yeah, I think if I were to teach these series of lessons again, it might be something I kind of review for next year when we roll them out again. I think explicitly mentioning the wealth of the church, where its money comes from, and how it is spent or not spent, I think there's a lot of mileage in that.
Yeah. All right. And there's some kind of chat in the comments a little bit that's making me think, do you address just more generally outside of Mormonism, religion and sort of social issues and progressive issues and things like that?
Yeah, I think that's something that the GCSE curriculum particularly does very well. So at my school, with the example that we go with, half of the course is the study of religions. Specifically, we do Christianity and Buddhism. And then the other half is kind of looking at ethical issues. So the four main topics we cover are issues of relationships, diverse religious attitudes towards that, issues of life and death, which is just a ridiculously broad, everything from abortion and euthanasia, evolution to the treatment of animals and everything. But then issues of crime and punishment and justice. And then the final one is issues of human rights. So we look at things like social justice, look at things to do with wealth inequality, and those kinds of issues. And then in the A-level syllabus, part of it which I teach is developments in Christian thought. And the final unit, which they do right at the end of year 13, so just before they go off to uni, is all about Marxism and liberation theology.
Right.
So kind of how Christian theology engages with wealth inequality.
And so this raises a broader question for me in terms of does in your sense does Mormonism come under the Christian umbrella, and if so, why? If not, especially why not?
Excellent question. I'm inclined to say that it does, because I think that we need to get away from an essentialist understanding of religion, where we kind of pretend that religions are these unified, discrete, individual things, which have really clearly definable, boundaries and beliefs that everybody agrees on. That's just not the case. Religions are like families. They kind of closely related groups which share some beliefs in common. But I think, for me, Mormonism, firstly, the fact that they identify themselves as Christian, I think is a good reason as good a reason as any to include them under the Christian umbrella. And also, I think they do, although theologically their views on the nature of Christ are very different from other traditions, other Christian denominations. I think they do accord a special status to Jesus and the divinity of Jesus, which I think gives them
Christian
a right to claim that Christian identity.
Okay.
And actually, in my talk at Sunstone, I kind of mentioned that as I think part of the reason why Mormonism often doesn't get discussed in or included in our curriculums is because it has this weird relationship. On the one hand, I think it would be inappropriate to treat Mormonism as a separate world religion, as if it's not part of Christianity. So therefore, you can't really justify doing an entire term or unit studying it as a world religion in its own right. But that means that if it is included, it often gets shoehorned into a unit on Christianity. And there's often simply not enough time to go into all the nuances of, oh yeah, there's this kind of odd little part of Christianity that doesn't really fit with the rest of it. The practicalities of trying to teach a religion in a limited number of curriculum hours means that you kind of teach in generalizations. And so Mormonism often gets kind of just ignored, or if it is included, it's just a little footnote.
Someone's asked a really, it could almost be seen as a facetious question, but I believe they're asking it sincerely. They've said, what about the use of the word Mormon? How do you refer to the name of the church, to the church?
So, yeah, that's a really good question. I avoided using the word Mormon or Mormonism about it, other than to say that often, given the nickname Mormons, that's often referred to as Mormonism. But I refer to it as the Latter-day Saint movement.
Okay.
Or if I'm talking specifically about the LDS Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Okay.
So in that sense then, because you're talking about both the movement and the church itself, and the Brighamite sect, as it were, there was a question in here, someone said the restoration of family tree would be interesting too as an observation in the evolution of wider religious movements. And I think that really speaks to what you were saying about how religions aren't this homogenous thing, they're like family groups, and the Latter-day Saint movement is like a family tree. You look at it with all its branches. And Joseph Smith was the common ancestor, but you look at Warren Jeff's group, you look at Community of Christ, you look at the Brighamite sect, three very different groups have come from the same progenitor. So yeah, I think that is interesting and possibly something you might even touch on at some point, to say that Mormonism isn't just this one church.
Absolutely. When I was initially planning the lessons, I had every intention of explicitly addressing that kind of internal diversity.
Hmm.
So specifically, some of my biggest regrets about things I had to cut out, basically.
Yeah.
Firstly, polygamy
Hmm.
was a real,
Yeah.
such a big thing not to discuss. But also community of Christ. I really wanted, when I was planning these lessons, to have the opportunity to talk about that kind of internal
Hmm.
diversity within the Restoration family. And I think if we were to expand it into a wider series of lessons,
Hmm.
those two practices that I zeroed in on in the
Hmm.
second lesson of missionary work and the temple,
Hmm.
I think we could do some really interesting comparisons with how those two concepts are explored in Community of Christ, where I'd say mission and temple are equally significant within Community of Christ, but mean entirely different things.
Hmm.
So I think, yeah, there's absolutely scope to explore that.
But then you could almost argue from a LDS perspective that that polygamy is inherently connected to the temple. It's part of the new and everlasting covenant, and so that would be a good way to maybe perhaps shoehorn it in a little bit. Do you get students asking about that? Because that's one of the common tropes about Mormons. People say, oh, they have multiple wives, right? You'd argue it's almost something we're more well known for than anything else.
Yes, it surprised me that
Hmm.
not many of my students brought it up or even seemed particularly aware of it.
It's because it's not in South Park.
I think
So
it probably
it's
is, yeah. um, yeah, no, so I mean, a couple of them came across it when they were just kind of Googling out of interest.
hmm
But even, they didn't even seem particularly bothered by it or surprised by it, which,
interesting.
yeah.
Could
So
that speak to a more like an openness of this generation towards relationships in general, that some of them don't see it as weird as those that maybe are more conservative about the idea of the family?
I think
Possibly.
so. And one of my colleagues mentioned that when he was marking some of the answers that students had written, one of them had mentioned that Mormons believe in polyamory,
Hmm.
um, which he said he kind of did a double take up. Uh, so yeah, I think it's
They believe in polyandry, or at least Joseph Smith did.
so I think there's a slight misconception involved
Mm,
there. But absolutely, the connection with the temple, like you mentioned,
yeah.
is one of the reasons why I feel that actually the way that I presented the temple in this really vague and somewhat whitewashed way,
Hmm.
um, it didn't have the impact that I expected it would.
Yeah.
Students mostly seemed kind of like they didn't really care
Well,
about it that much.
because what I will say, because I will say this out loud, even as an active member of the church, I will say that unless you can tell them that you stand there in a room with no windows, promising to slit your own throat, lest you tell anyone about what you've just done, that because it's still in there. The hand symbols are the hand signs are still in there. The actions have been taken out, but you're still under the same promise. Unless you can tell them that, unless you can tell them that the only time you get to say no is before you've made any of the promises you're going to make, I don't think you're going to get that impact. Bowing your head and saying yes, unless you can tell them that that's what goes on, to them it's just going to seem, as the Mormon Church tries to paint it, just like any other religious ceremony or form of religious worship, when in fact, arguably, what you're not able to give your students, not the ammunition, but you're not able to give them the thing they need to actually point towards Mormonism as a dangerous cult, because
Yeah,
you're not able to talk about it.
yeah, I 100% agree. And actually, I found when I was marking their responses, the ones who wrote about that, the ammunition they used was almost exclusively about missionary work, and the rules that and kind of the restrictions that are placed upon missionaries and the
Yeah,
pressure that is to go there. Because I was able to be a lot more
open.
open about that, because the church is open about it, even if they don't publicize it, it's out there. So yeah, whereas the temple thing, the most I could say to make it to give a sense of what it's like was, well, nobody, once it's been dedicated, nobody who is not a member of the church is allowed to go inside. They're not allowed to see what happens. And in order to go there, you have to have a wordless interview with the church leader. And that doesn't sound as scary as it would if they,
Understood.
Yeah. But it's a difficulty, like I said before, trying to get that balance of I want to, I don't want to give the church just a free pass. I don't want to just kind of, allow the church to dominate how it's presented and how it's perceived. But in the same breath, I don't want to. I'm mindful of how a Latter-day Saint child would perceive and feel being in that classroom.
But much like sex education, I suppose that's the parents' choice. Maybe give the parents a warning and say, look, we're going to talk about the Mormon endowment in today's lesson. There's nothing the parents can do to legally stop you talking about that. It may be sacred to them, but they can't do anything. So, we're within our rights to talk about it. So, I don't know, it's a tricky one, and I don't envy you. And you're getting a lot of love in the comments here. Elliot Woodland says, I admire all RE teachers' ability to discuss the good, bad, and ugly of religion while still being impartial. It's a very difficult line to tread, especially if a student is religious. So, people are understanding of the difficult line you have to tread. So maybe polygamy might be a better way of showing some of the issues with women's equality and things. But then, like you're saying, you're not actually here to show the issues with Mormonism fully. You're here to give a very balanced view, whereas obviously me, I'm quite critical these days, quite skeptical. So yeah, excellent. Well, if anyone has any other questions, stick them in the chat. If not, I think we might wrap this up. We've had a nice little chat about teaching religion. So if you could give everyone one takeaway as to kind of how to teach about Mormonism, just because people are going to go out into their everyday life. Some people that watch this channel have either been Mormons or are still Mormons, still members of the church, and they're going to encounter people. And the only frame of reference we have for teaching about Mormonism so far is, I want to try and convert someone. That's what's been drilled into us for years. So we take that away. As a religious education teacher, how would you have us frame those discussions with people to explain Mormonism and to talk to them about it?
Good question. I think Mormonism is interesting and fascinating and worth discussing and worth learning about for any number of reasons that have nothing to do with whether it's true or not. So I think you can approach it in any number of ways. The route that I sort of went down with my head of department was to say, look, let's investigate it almost from a sociological point of view, as an example of this occupies an almost unique position of kind of straddling the line between a mainstream religion and a cult or a new charismatic movement. But you can approach it as a very alternative interpretation of Christianity as well. You can approach it from a theological point of view. So I don't think there is, in a way, I don't think it matters what particular framework you use, because I think there's so many different reasons to find it interesting, regardless of whether it's true or not. Having said that, even the fact of the arguably scandalous kind of truth claims that it makes, the historical truth claims and the outlandishness of them, is also a very good reason to study and engage them. And I think those kind of grappling with the philosophical issues that those raise, what are the proper grounds for belief? What are proper reasons for religious faith? Is religious experience, is kind of a feeling a good basis for religious faith? Is asking God directly the best way to make up your mind about religious questions? If so, what are you kind of expecting to receive in return? And I think just anything which encourages people to explore those questions, I think is very good, whether that's coming through the lens of Mormonism or whether it's coming outside of it.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining in the live chat. We've got some good questions in there. The questions in the chat, someone wants to know if this will go beyond your school, and I hope that it would. I hope that Mormonism will make it into the zeitgeist, because it is a really interesting case study, as you say. So I'd usually, at this point, plug where you can go find Ryan, but he probably doesn't want you to know what school he works at, so don't go bothering him. But thank you very much, Ryan, for coming on the show. Thank you very much. Everyone, remember that you can get yourself a horse, and that'd be pretty cool for Christmas. You can pop them on top of your Christmas tree if you still put Christmas trees up. So thank you very much, everybody, for watching. Thank you very much, Ryan. And we'll see you all soon. No worries. Have a great evening.